If you use nothing but nuclear power for your entire life, your waste would fit in about one soda can.
Today I'm sitting down with Liz Muller, the founder and CEO of Deep Fission. Liz and her team are building micro-nuclear reactors that they're putting 1 mile under the ground. They recently received fast-track status from the United States Department of Energy, and they plan to deploy their first reactors in July 2026.
The nuclear power is the safest source of electricity that we have today, period.
Now, the reason why I wanted to have Liz on is she represents exactly what we need to power a decentralized real economy. It represents decentralized, clean, abundant energy.
I do think that nuclear is going to make a comeback, and we're going to see that in the next 2 to 3 years.
I hope you enjoy the conversation, and remember to go direct. Okay, we are live. Liz, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How about you, Jordan?
I'm doing great, thanks. Well, I'm excited to have this conversation. I am not by any means an energy expert, and so we'll do a little bit of Energy 101 if you're okay with that at the beginning here. But just to kind of level set this, one of the main theme to everything we're doing is decentralization, and Liz and her team are working on something very, very interesting, and we'll talk obviously a lot about it around micro-nuclear reactors and fission reactors. And, the reality is this: if we're ever going to decentralize the real economy, decentralized production is the heart of that. And we're going to need a ton of clean energy to power our data centers for the whole AI revolution, robotics revolution, and in our factories. So highly, highly relevant. Yeah. So thanks again for taking the time.
Yeah. Excited to be here. Excited to dive in.
Okay. So we're going to start just very basic here. So for folks that don't come from the energy space at all, can you just explain what fission is in just in the most basic sense?
Yeah, so nuclear fission is basically when you get atoms that are bigger and bigger and bigger, and at some point you get to atoms that are so big that they can't withstand their own weight anymore. And so if you take those atoms and you add just one more neutron to them, then they break apart. They sort of crumble apart. And when they do that, they create a tremendous amount of energy, heat in the fragments that are apart. If you can harness that energy, that is called nuclear energy. And so it's fundamentally taking uranium-235 atoms, which are very large atoms, and then hitting them with a neutron so that they can't sustain themselves anymore, and they break into smaller pieces and release nuclear power.
Cool. Thank you very much. And I think everyone always hears fusion, fission, and so can you just give us the quick rundown on the difference in the two types of energy?
Yeah, so fusion is the opposite. So fusion is when you take really, really small molecules and you get them close together and then they merge together. So they fuse together. And that also creates a lot of energy. So it's just fundamentally a different process in how you work with atoms.
Right, and the input's differently because it's typically hydrogen, right, that you're inputting for fusion. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I think the first question beyond our little 101 is, why should we care about nuclear fission as it relates to a source of power?
Yeah, I mean, power is so important today. So power is everything. Like everything we need to do requires power. So, power is economic development. Power, as you hinted at earlier, is AI. It's our ability to get things done, to travel, to transportation, all of that. Nuclear power is an important source of that power because it's very reliable. So it's like coal and natural gas and oil, and that you can depend on it. It's always there. And it's also clean. So it's fundamentally the only source of dependable, reliable, long-term power generation that is also clean.
Great. And obviously, when people hear nuclear, most people they just go right to Chernobyl or Fukushima and the accidents that have happened, and kind of, typically you hear the detractors around nuclear as a potential energy source, safety, waste, public perception. So can we just go through each one, and I would like for you to debunk it a little bit
Yeah.
of what the common misconception is and why, and what actually in your mind what the reality is. So let's start with safety.
Yeah, so nuclear power is the safest source of electricity that we have today, period. So even if you include the horrific accidents that we've had historically, which are not using modern technology for nuclear reactors, but even if you include all of those, they're safer, or they're very close in safety to wind and solar, but they're safer. And they're significantly safer than coal and natural gas and other types of electricity generation. So nuclear power, people tend to think of the accidents. It's almost like comparing cars to airplanes, right? People tend to have more fear of airplanes because if there is a crash, it's more spectacular. But fundamentally, air travel is more safe than car travel. And it's the same with nuclear power. It is extremely safe.
Waste.
The waste problem needs to be solved. I'm gonna agree with the detractors on this one. And in fact, one of the companies that I co-founded 10 years ago, Deep Isolation, is looking to solve the nuclear waste problem. So the nuclear industry is correct in that the amount of waste that you generate from nuclear power is very small. It's, if you use nothing but nuclear power for your entire life, power everything you do, all of your transportation, all of your computing, everything, your waste would fit in about one soda can. So it's not a lot of waste. It's in fact a very small amount of waste. But the waste that is in that soda can is quite dangerous. And if you held it near you, it would kill you. So it needs to be safely managed and safely handled. And still, as of today, nobody anywhere in the world has ever disposed of spent nuclear fuel or high-level nuclear waste. And that's wrong. I think the detractors who point this out they have a point. Now, I don't think it should stop us from using nuclear energy because there's still many, many reasons to use nuclear energy. But I do think that we absolutely need to move forward with solving the nuclear waste problem. And that's what Deep Isolation, my other company, is looking to do.
Great. And then public perception.
Public perception has changed a lot in the past few years. So, used to be that people were mostly concerned with accidents, but I think there's an increasing understanding that nuclear power is the safest source of electricity that we have today, and particularly with people who are more concerned about climate change. There's an appreciation that we do need nuclear power. So I think that has shifted quite a lot. The nuclear waste issue is usually the one that comes up at cocktail parties. That one, I think, can be addressed. It doesn't have to be this massive unsolved problem, but it needs focused efforts on the behalf of governments who have taken the responsibility for nuclear waste disposal. So that I think is an accurate issue that needs to be addressed. And then the final one that comes up less often is the cost issue. And that's more of an expert concern. So people are concerned because nuclear power is just too expensive. And I believe that is probably the biggest challenge that the nuclear industry is facing. So the waste problem can be solved. The safety issue is already very, very good. But we do need to lower the cost of nuclear power if it's really going to be able to compete with coal and natural gas.
What is it at right now, approximately, like per kilowatt hour, if you're to compare nuclear versus coal or natural gas?
So the numbers will vary a little bit, so don't hold me to these strictly. But we're looking at nuclear, at least in the U.S., about 18 cents per kilowatt hour. Okay. Coal and natural gas, again, it depends on where you are. So those are hyper local, but somewhere in the 5 to 6 cent range per kilowatt hour.
And where does natural gas come out at right now?
Again, it depends on where you are and the pipeline situation. It's much higher in Europe and most of the world than it is in the United States.
Okay.
But in the United States, again, depending, sort of around 5 to 6 cents.
How so currently, how do folks deal with the nuclear waste? Like, what's the process typically?
So when you use the fuel for a nuclear reactor, you then take the fuel out of the reactor and you put it in a pool for a couple of years, and it'll stay there and cool down. And then they take it out of the pools and they put it in dry casks for storage. So these are really big concrete and steel containers that they leave on site at the nuclear reactors themselves. At least that's how they do it in the United States typically. And those are still there today. So we still have no process or plan for nuclear waste disposal. So all of the waste is in temporary storage at the nuclear reactor facility.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about this before we started rolling, but we both have a connection to France, which we can get into. But, France has famously been known as the country that has gotten it right as it relates to nuclear. A lot of people like to say, I think 70% or so of their electricity comes from nuclear.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you know a lot on the background, but why did they decide to go all in on nuclear? And just kind of unpack that for us a little bit if you are educated in the history behind that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a historian, but my understanding is that France didn't have a lot of other options. And not having access to some of the coal and natural gas resources of other parts of Europe, and took a very thoughtful, smart decision that if they went all in on nuclear, they could bring the price down. And that really proved out. So they have, as you said, 70 to 80% of their power right now is from nuclear. And that's been a really massive boon for their economy and their power generation.
Yeah, I think it's just an interesting point of when like a government makes a decision from a policy standpoint of like what's important, and they're going to subsidize that or make it work. It just shows what can be done when there's the will,
Yeah.
All right, let's move over a little bit to Deep Fission. And so your team is building micro nuclear reactors and deep undergrounds in the most basic sense. So talk to us a little bit about what you're actually doing and the design choices that you made.
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of a history. How we came up with the idea for putting nuclear power plants a mile underground, because it wasn't intuitive. And this came out of our work on nuclear waste disposal. So Deep Isolation is doing nuclear waste disposal in boreholes a mile underground because that's where it's safest. That's where you're sure it's not going to get out and into your water table. And there's good consensus it needs to be deep underground. And what Deep Isolation realizes, you don't need people underground. It's much simpler, cheaper, faster, and safer if you could insert the waste from the surface with no people ever needing to go underground. And then one of our customers asked us, here are a list of all the things that could possibly go wrong when you're doing this for nuclear waste disposal. And one of them was, what if accidentally, instead of putting nuclear waste in a borehole a mile underground, you put fresh fuel in a borehole a mile underground? Is there any chance that under that accident scenario, the uranium-235 would start to create heat? And if that happened, what is the consequence of that situation? So we did the calculations, and the answer was no. There was no chance that a single fresh fuel assembly in a borehole a mile underground could start generating nuclear reactions. But as we were doing the calculations, we realized that in some ways it was the ideal scenario. And that's because the expense of nuclear power is not the core. It's not the fission reaction for uranium-235. That is actually the simplest part of a nuclear reactor. So the complexity and the cost in nuclear power comes from all of the systems around the core. So it's the containment. You want to make sure that these fission fragments don't get out. You want to make sure that there's not a runaway reaction. You want to make sure that the heat doesn't get out into a place that's not prepared for it. And so that containment and the containment structures and the containment dome and the massive amounts of concrete and steel is really one of the big expenses for nuclear power. Another one is the pressure. So you need to have a high pressure environment so that your water doesn't boil, so that you can generate electricity from that heat. And so for a traditional pressurized water reactor, which is the most common type of nuclear reactor we have today, you need 160 atmospheres of pressure. So you need to have a pressurizer that costs you $1 billion. You need to have a reactor vessel that's massive and can withstand that pressure, another $1 billion. And those can only be fabricated in South Korea or Japan. And so that adds another degree of cost and complexity. And then the last one is the cooling systems. So these are the systems to cool down the reactor, to recirculate the systems, to have emergency core cooling in case anything goes wrong. And those three things together are between about 80% and 92% of the cost of nuclear power. So when we were looking at this borehole and this, accident scenario where we put fresh fuel down a borehole, what we realized is that in a borehole, you have the containment. So you have all the containment you could possibly want. You're surrounded by billions of tons of rock. Nothing's going to get out. It's much better containment than you could build, with above ground construction. You also have the pressure. So this was really even more remarkable. At a mile deep, you have 160 atmospheres of pressure, exactly what you would want for a pressurized water reactor. And that's because the water that's above you in the borehole is pushing down on your reactor and creating that pressure. It's like, when you're scuba diving and you get 1 atmosphere of pressure for every 10 meters of water. Well, here at a mile deep, that's about 1,600 meters, so 160 atmospheres of pressure. And then that water is also your emergency core cooling system. So you actually have everything that is so expensive in conventional nuclear power. You have, for free or for the cost of drilling a borehole if you put your reactor in a borehole a mile underground.
And what is the diameter of the borehole?
So we would like big boreholes. So okay. When we were doing this initial test, we were looking at an 18-inch diameter borehole, which would hold one single fuel assembly. And that wouldn't go critical. So you don't have enough fuel in that to create a sustained reaction. So we've moved towards larger boreholes, and we are currently looking at designs that have 4 fuel assemblies. So that's about a 30-inch borehole. And we're looking at designs that have 9 fuel assemblies. So that's about a 45 to 50-inch borehole. And those designs do require much larger boreholes. So this is borehole sizes that are not commonly drilled in the oil and gas industry, but they have been done before. And so this is something that we are actively working with drilling partners on to design the first deep fission boreholes.
What is it? What's a typical oil and gas borehole diameter?
So they can start quite large at the top. So 30 inches at the top is not that unusual. But then at the very bottom at depth, it's somewhere in the 4 to 8 inches range typically.
Oh, it's like super
much smaller. Small. Yeah.
And then, so you're putting the reactors deep underground. The conditions are actually, it's very fascinating that you just thought that you stumbled upon it and that represents potentially from a cost reduction. And is it each reactor can generate about 15 megawatts? Is that about right?
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And just to level set, that's about 10 to 15,000 homes. Is that right?
That sounds about right. Yep.
Okay. And then the idea, right, is if you think about it, I'm going to bring up an image from the website because I think it shows it in a very interesting way. But the idea is if you just want to do more assemblies, you just do them adjacent to each other. And is there a maximum?
Not really.
Okay.
It depends on your customer, right? So if you have, it's truly modular. You can have one single borehole and that's 15 megawatts electric. You can have 10 boreholes and that's 150 megawatts electric. But you can also have 100 holes or 200 holes or 300 holes. And 100 holes is about 1.5 gigawatts. So that is a large implementation. Typical above ground reactors are about a gigawatt. So this is comparable with what you would get from a large conventional nuclear reactor.
Got it. And so I just, for the folks that are listening, I brought an image up that shows visually what Liz was just describing of how you're putting the reactors adjacent to each other as you want to scale up the amount of power generation. How much land is that in aggregate if you wanted to do a 1.5 gigawatt, plants versus what a traditional one would take up from a landmass standpoint?
So the land for the boreholes themselves is very compact. So you
Okay.
can drill these pretty close together. So for 100 holes, about 3 acres is sufficient. Now, I'm going to caveat that by saying that's just for the boreholes themselves, but we are going to need surface systems. We're going to need to be able to put things into the holes. And so we're going to need some sort of coil tubing rig or some sort of workover rig. We're also going to need turbines and systems to generate electricity. So it is going to be more than 3 acres, but that gives you a sense for just how dense this energy source is.
How big a 1.5 gigawatt nuclear plant today? Like, what size is that? Like, just generally, like, how big is the site?
Yeah, it depends a lot. So there are
Okay.
some sites like San Onofre, which is now a closed reactor in California, that have very small amount of land. So they've been forced to work with what they have, and it's quite compact. I don't remember off the hand how many acres it is, but it is a small piece of land. And then you have other reactors that have a lot of land, and so they might have a full mile or close to a mile in radius with that they own the land. So it really depends a lot.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about supply chain. Can you just explain what low or enriched uranium is?
Yeah. So low enriched uranium, which is typically enriched to about 5%, is what nuclear reactors typically use today. So this is you increase the concentration of uranium 235. It's that magic molecule that I mentioned earlier. Those are the ones that we can get to fission, to break apart. And so you want to have as much in your fuel as you can in order to have a longer fuel cycle. However, the governments around the world have historically said that above 5%, it's not safe. There's risk of terrorists creating dirty bombs and just various other things. So historically, there was a limit at 5%. Now that is currently being pushed. So we are currently seeing providers who are saying, well, we think we can get to 6%, or we think we can get to 8%. And that is increasingly accepted as still being, we call it LEU plus, so low enriched uranium plus. And that's increasingly being accepted as fuel that is viable. Now, there is another type of reactor fuel called HALEU, which is up to 19.75% enriched. Many of the advanced reactor designs require that type of fuel, which again, because it's more highly enriched, has more uranium 235 in it, and so it can last for a longer time. However, the supply chain for that fuel doesn't exist today. So that is a real challenge for many of these advanced reactor companies who have to focus not only on building their advanced reactor, but also on figuring out how they're going to be able to get that fuel, which again, just doesn't exist today.
And is uranium pretty abundant all over the world, or is it coming from a few different specific markets?
Yeah, uranium is very abundant.
Okay.
But typically people mine for it. And we had been mining for it in the US until we got sort of the low hanging fruit, and then it was cheaper to import it from places like Russia. But uranium, you can even get it from seawater. So there's not an abundancy problem. What there is a cheap problem. So as the cost goes up, we will be able to find more of it. But if we can be put out of business, or our uranium companies can be put out of business by someone else coming in and lowering the cost, then that is historically the reason that we haven't been producing as much in the United States.
Gotcha. And then how about the enriching process? Because that's a whole separate thing, right?
It is, and it's a complex supply chain. Yeah. So it's not just about mining the uranium. You then have to convert it. You then have to enrich it. And what you eventually get is uranium pellets that they put into fuel rods that they then assemble into fuel assemblies. So it's a complex supply chain. But the good news is that for those low enriched uranium, so for the up to 5% enriched, that does exist today. So there is a readily available supply chain, and Deep Fission is able to use low enriched uranium fuel. So that's very helpful to us.
Great. I read also that, switching back over to actually your actual reactor design, that you're using a pretty standard reactor design. Is that correct? Or like talk to us a little bit about what other things that you're building custom, if anything, in the reactor.
Yeah, great
Yeah.
question. So pressurized water reactors, it's what I keep coming back to. It is the most common type of reactor that we have today. Now, our design it is a pressurized water reactor. So it is something that we know how it works. There are hundreds of them around the world. We understand the fuel. We understand the pressure mechanisms. We understand the cooling systems. This is all something we've done a lot of. What Deep Fission is doing is taking that same core concept of a pressurized water reactor, but making it significantly smaller. So either with 4 fuel assemblies or 9 fuel assemblies, and then putting it in a borehole a mile underground. So we are combining conventional nuclear technology with existing drilling technology. So we know how to drill holes. We know how to create that borehole. And then we're also combining it with geothermal technology in terms of how do you take heat that's at the bottom of a borehole and bring it to the surface and then use that to generate electricity. So Deep Fission is combining 3 relatively mature existing technologies, but doing so in a way that is innovative and has never been done before.
I'm going to ask probably maybe it's a dumb question, but now I just lost my train of thought. It's almost lost it. I'll come back to it. From a technical perspective, what's the hardest part of what you're building?
So interestingly, the hardest part of what we're doing is those larger boreholes. So, we feel really good about a 30-inch borehole. 30-inch boreholes, not easy by oil and gas standards, but we expect to be able to do it more or less using readily available equipment. But for the 30-inch borehole, you can only put 4 fuel assemblies in there, which means that your fuel efficiency is poor. And what I mean by that is what you really want is when your uranium-235 breaks apart and emits additional neutrons, you want it to hit another uranium-235. So if you can keep that within a core where there's lots of uranium-235, you have better efficiency. A smaller diameter borehole has poor fuel efficiency because neutrons will sometimes get out into the surrounding, the water, the borehole, the rock. Whereas if you can keep them within the uranium-235 by having a larger diameter, then you get better fuel efficiency. So our challenge is moving to those large diameter boreholes, and we are definitely pushing the limits of what can be done using conventional oil and gas technology.
But why is it such a problem just to make a larger borehole? Is it the actual machinery to drill them is the limiting factor, or is it like
so you're going to need and I should be clear, it's not such a problem, right? This is our biggest problem, but it's not something that we feel uncomfortable about. It's something that we are very confident we can overcome because it's not that big a deal. But it's things like, do you have a drill bit that's large enough for a large diameter borehole? Do you have a blowout preventer that you can use? What about casing? The casing, as you go to larger diameter holes, gets very heavy, and we're going deeper with that size of borehole than you would typically do for a shallow well. So those are the sorts of challenges that we're grappling with. Not rocket science. It shouldn't be that hard to figure it out. But that, amazingly, is actually our biggest challenge right now.
I just remember the question. You're a mile underground. What if something goes wrong? How do you get that? How do you get down there?
Yeah. So the beauty of it is that if something goes wrong, it's hard to imagine a scenario in which that impacts human health or the environment. So again, this is, a mile underground. You're a mile below the water table. You've taken precautions to seal everything off. And it's a relatively small reactor. So the chances of anything being able to impact the surface is quite low. In fact, we are struggling to come up with scenarios in which that's a problem. So the scenario that you're talking about is really one of an economic loss. So if something goes wrong, you may need to seal it off and never again use that reactor. Now you could, of course, pull it up and try to fix it, but our expectation is that trying to fix it is actually going to be more expensive than just replacing it. So we are looking at using the reactor at the bottom of the borehole for its fuel life, and that will depend again on the size of the borehole. So if we're looking somewhere in the 2 to 7 years range, and then at the end of that lifetime, we will seal that off, put another reactor on the top. So we can pull things out of the borehole, but what we want to avoid is pulling the nuclear waste out of the borehole, because then you have to deal with potential exposure to that waste at the surface, which can be done. I mean, there have been, we know how to handle spent nuclear fuel. We can do that safely, but it does add a significant cost. Whereas if we keep that waste at the borehole where there's no risk that it's going to have exposure to humans or the environment, then it does reduce our cost very significantly.
So just make sure I followed, but does the reactor stay down there?
The reactor would stay down there.
And you would just put a new one on. So this basically, the reactor is basically after 2 to 7 years. Basically, that's just kind of abandoned with the waste, and then one goes on top. If I understand.
Yeah. So it's the on-site temporary storage, right?
Yeah.
So that's what reactors are doing today, right? Their waste is kept on-site. So our equivalent of on-site is going to be at the bottom of the borehole. Now, what we would love to be able to do eventually is say, well, it's not just going to be on-site temporary storage. This is also a disposal solution. So we have evidence that nuclear waste in boreholes is one of the safest ways of eventually disposing of nuclear waste. So if the laws allow, if the local community agrees that this is the safest way to handle the waste, there is a potential to be able to eventually say, okay, it's not just in the borehole for temporary storage, but it is now in the borehole for disposal. And that is something that we're very interested in for the long term.
I have a practical question for you, because you just mentioned, which is I'm sure a big one, which is community acceptance and where you're building. And when you have I think I read recently half the U.S. population reads below a 12-year-old level. Many people are low information. Just they're busy, right? They're busy living their lives, trying to raise their kids. Like they just don't have time to take in good information. Like how do you envision? Because you haven't done it yet. But going about that education process to really get people to understand, because I feel like it's a pretty heavy lift.
Yeah, it really depends on where you are. So there has been a massive shift towards acceptance of nuclear energy in the United States over the past 5 years. And so again, it depends on the state, depends on the specific community, depends on the region. But we have already started community outreach in a number of locations. So we've recently announced that we expect to be building reactors in Utah, in Texas, and in Kansas. And these are 3 states where we've found that there's not only an openness to new nuclear, but really an excitement about new nuclear, because it is the cleanest source of electricity that we have, and the safest source of electricity that we have. And many people do get that, and they do understand that. So I think that where you site is a really important decision. And I expect that eventually we'll get to the point where there's even more acceptance of the deep fission reactor, particularly given our depth and the important safety profiles that we can bring. But we've been pleasantly surprised at the level of education that these communities have to begin with, and the level of interest that they have in deep fission.
That's great to hear. There's definitely been a vibe shift, which is great, the past few years, and I think that's a good segue to. I think recently you announced, and congratulations, that Deep Fission was one of the few companies that received funding from the DOE for a nuclear pilot program, correct?
So it's a pilot program that we're going to participate in, but we have to fund it ourselves. So there's no DOE funding in it.
I thought there was no funding? That's not fun.
No funding, but it is a fast path. So what's so exciting about this pilot program is the speed at which we are going to be able to build. So the Department of Energy is going to have to authorize our reactor. So we're still going to have to prove that it is extremely safe. and there's going to be no cutting corners. It's going to be, you have to really demonstrate the highest levels of safety that this is going to work and that it's going to be safe for humans and the environment. But it doesn't have to take a long time to get there. So the target date for having first reactors turn on is July 4th, 2026. So that's 275 days from now, at least as of the recording. It's probably going to be later, less than that when this gets released. But, we're counting down because it's a tremendous opportunity. We had expected to build our reactor in 2029. And now all of a sudden we have this fast path to build it in 2026, which is very exciting.
Can you just explain to the audience a little bit who don't have much exposure to this, but like how big of a deal that is, and when you think about NEPA and other rules and regulations, like how prohibitive it's been to even try to build something like this? Just because I think most people don't really have a appreciation for that aspect of what the administration's trying to do. So,
yeah. Great question. So historically, with large above ground nuclear reactors, you're looking at 6 to 10 years in order to get through the licensing process. And then that is, before you can even begin construction. So you have this very high, and we're talking about thousands upon thousands of pages of documents that are proving every aspect of safety. And so it's very complex, and it's very burdensome and very time consuming. And so if we're looking at a data center that wants electricity now, right? Maybe they would take it in 6 months or 12 months, but waiting 6 to 10 years to even begin construction is not really an option. And so this has been one of the reasons that nuclear has been really not able to deliver the short-term massive scale of demand that we're seeing right now. It's just been too slow.
So speaking of funding, the team recently announced that you did a SPAC. So you're now a public company. So for my two questions here, to be able to fund the next phase of growth. But my first question was so I think it was Oklo, and then I have the other name because I'm not familiar with this, Terra Novatum. They all also went through a SPAC and have gone public. And so can you just explain the dynamics of what's going on and why there all of a sudden you have 3 nuclear companies doing a SPAC, and then we'll go specifically to what Deep Fission did.
Yeah. So I'll start by saying that we actually did not do a SPAC. So Deep Fission went through a different process called an alternative public offering, or APO, which in some ways is similar to a SPAC, but it also has some important differences. But it is a go public transaction, and it is emerging into an existing public company, and then sort of using that as a fast path to becoming public. But I think what we're seeing right now, and part of this is the massive amount of demand that we're seeing for nuclear power. And part of this is the new executive orders and sort of the fast track that we're seeing for nuclear power. But there is a opportunity right now for nuclear to move forward quickly. And if we can leverage that and build nuclear quickly, and I'm talking about, in a couple of years, not in 10 years, then the demand is there and the path is there. So we are seeing a lot of companies go public right now because of this opportunity to move quickly, to build reactors, and that needs to be funded as well. So there's definitely that dynamic as well.
So can you give us a sense? And I think it was like about a $30 million transaction. So can you give us a sense of where you're targeting to build first, and kind of just the general cost of, where you're going to build first, the size of the reactor, and like just the general cost of building just those first reactors?
Yeah. So what I can say is we also have aspirations to move on to the NASDAQ and to do another round as part of that process. So we are expecting to raise more funding in hopefully the not too distant future. And we we're using this in order to begin work on our reactor. So there are certain things that need to happen early on before we can even begin construction. We need to order those long lead time items, including our fuel. And so this transaction has enabled us to begin that work so that we can potentially deliver our reactor in 2026.
Great. I want to move over to this kind of the decentralization angle because, as an energy novice, when I think of a power plant or nuclear plant, I think of like this big, huge centralized thing that plugs into the grid. And so I find it very fascinating. It's a whole reorientation, right, of how you deploy infrastructure.
Yeah.
And so can you just talk a little bit? You talked a little bit about the cost difference being 70 to 80% lower.
Yeah.
Can we talk about the efficiency difference? And then because I do want to get into kind of transmission and ISOs and stuff like that after, but just really understand having a decentralized model, how does that affect efficiency and delivering the power?
Yeah. So one of the other things that we're seeing is that transmission is expensive, right? And so and you lose some of the electricity through transmission as well. So having the source of power being near the customer is helpful. And so, we have been working with some of our customers to potentially co-locate the nuclear, Deep Fission nuclear facility with a data center or another customer so that they don't have to transmit. The power source is really near the place where it's going to need to be used.
And where do you envision kind of deploying for what use first? Is it going to be because of the demand on the data center side? Is that most likely the logical place of where you're going to, are the things you're going to power first?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay.
So what we're seeing right now is just a skyrocketing demand for large amounts of electricity, primarily from the data centers. So, historically, when we were first thinking about Deep Fission, we were imagining small communities that don't have access to the grid, don't have access to power, and we can do that too. But I think where we need to go first is where there is this massive pull right now, and that's to data centers.
And a little bit of money going in there too, right?
Yeah, just a little bit.
It's pretty mind boggling when you start seeing these numbers, you're just like, wow, that's exciting for Deep Fission, which is great.
Yeah.
Okay. You have a very long path in history and in the space. And so talk to me about how did you even get interested in energy and clean energy and nuclear specifically?
Yeah, great question. So my father is a nuclear physicist. So he's a professor at UC Berkeley, and his mentor was Louis Alvarez, who was like a grandfather to me when I was a kid. So, Louis was one of the founding fathers of the whole nuclear industry back in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. And so I grew up with this family that was very, very supportive of nuclear power and, knew a lot about it. But they were both professors of physics at UC Berkeley. And so I grew up in Berkeley, California, which is extremely anti-nuclear. And so all of my friends were anti-nuclear. All of my teachers were anti-nuclear. And so I don't think I dared think much. I was sort of hesitant, do I support nuclear power? Do I not support nuclear power? As a kid, you just don't know, until I moved to France. And it was really when I was living in France and I would ask people, what do you think about nuclear power? And I would ask another person, and everyone universally that I asked was, well, of course I support nuclear power. It's reliable, it's clean, it's secure, it's always on, sort of all of these reasons. And I think that opened my eyes to nuclear doesn't have to be controversial. And if you can solve these basic issues, the challenges that we're having with nuclear, then it really is a fantastic energy source because it's clean and reliable and always on and secure and sort of all of these reasons. And so returning to the US, and, climate change was also more of a thing. Energy security was more of a thing. And so why aren't we doing more with nuclear? And, in the cocktail circuit, I always got the answer that it's the nuclear waste problem. So that felt like the one we could tackle first. And then the cost one, as I sort of described earlier, the concept behind deep fission came about. A lot of luck was involved, but as soon as we realized we might be able to not only solve the nuclear waste problem, but also solve the cost problem, it was really a passion project for me. We've got to go do this. We've got to enable the future of nuclear power.
That's great. And so how big's the team now?
So we're about 35 people and growing, but not growing as much as one might expect. I think we are able to leverage AI. So not only are we powering AI, but we're using AI internally. And so, I know another number of other companies have hundreds of employees, but I don't think we're going to need to get that big, at least not anytime soon.
When you say you use AI, how are you using it internally at the company? Like in what way? Meaningful way?
We're using it in every single part of the company. So everything we do, from the engineering to the licensing to marketing, we're able to leverage AI. We do have to be careful because there are national security controls on nuclear, so we're not able to use AI for absolutely everything, but we are able to use it for a large fraction of our work. So having specific engineering GPTs that we can work with to play around with different scenarios, but also on the licensing side, there's a lot that can be done. I mentioned earlier these thousands of pages of documents. Well, I don't think we're going to need a team of 50 people to do that anymore. I think it's going to be a small team who's able to leverage AI and existing work that's already been done. So we're really expecting and already seeing some fantastic efficiency gains using AI.
Great. If all goes well, in your mind, you project out 10 years from now, where is Deep Fission?
I mean, I think it's going to be tremendously exciting. I think there is an opportunity right now to build reactors and to build reactors quickly. So we are looking at having our first commercial implementations within a couple of years. And then once we've proven out that not only can we build these reactors quickly, but we can do so at the 80% cost savings that we are expecting, nuclear is going to be cost competitive with coal and natural gas, with all the benefits that nuclear brings. So I think we're going to be expanding very, very quickly in the United States, but also internationally.
So how does that, so just so I get a better sense, how does that work? So once you get the approval, you build your first few, do you have to get all new approvals, or that kind of the only thing you need is the local approval from the local community that they're okay with you doing whatever it is that you're going to do there?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. So, you don't, if the nuclear regulator has already signed off on, certain things, they probably will not need to redo that analysis unless something has changed. So if there's a reason that, you've changed the technology, or maybe the geology is different in a way that actually impacts the safety of the reactor, then you will need to redo that. So it's specific for the new location, but most of it should be pretty standardized.
Is it hard to find talent because it's been pretty much a nascent industry for so long in the US?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a combination. We're definitely having a skills shortage in nuclear right now. So that is definitely just the world that we are operating in. But I also think that there is a tremendous amount of excitement around deep fission specifically. So we are hiring a lot of people, and we're not finding it nearly as difficult as I had expected that we might. I think, again, just because people recognize that this concept that we're doing it has the potential to completely transform the way that we think about nuclear power, and people find that exciting.
If nuclear makes a comeback, I need a prediction from you. What percentage of our power comes from nuclear by 2050 in the US?
Oh gosh, great question. I guess what I'm going to do, so probably not answer the question directly, but I do think that nuclear is going to make a comeback, and we're going to see that in the next 2 to 3 years. Okay. So it's not going to be the 5 to 10 that most people expect. We're going to see this fast because there are new entrants like Deep Fission that are going to be able to start to deliver this power within those shorter timeframes. So nuclear is going to see a comeback, I think, very quickly. And then what I'm expecting is the fraction of new electricity that's going to be added to the grid is going to veer heavily nuclear. So we're not going to replace the existing natural
Sure.
gas and coal plants in the short term. But I think in terms of new electricity generation, I don't know. I think my guess would be upwards of 50%, maybe even as high as 80% of new power will be generated with nuclear.
Do you see the same similar movement in other countries beyond the U.S. around nuclear? I mean, independent of France because they're already bought in. But do you see similar and interest in what you're doing from many other countries?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's been a global demand for nuclear power. A number of countries are talking about tripling the amount of nuclear energy that we use by 2050. So that's not just the US, that's global and very exciting time. Now, what the US has right now that is unique is this short-term fast path to getting a reactor up and running. So we had been thinking about whether our first reactor was going to be built in the United States or whether we wanted to build it somewhere else that had a faster path. But now, hands down, we have this amazing path in the United States. So we do expect to be building here first.
Yeah, I saw the numbers. I actually have it here. It's was it China plans to go from 3 to 8 terawatts by 2050. Well, we plan to go from 1 to 2, so we got some catching up to do from that standpoint. That's for sure. All right, so you ready for a few rapid fires before we wrap up?
Let's go.
Okay. One person in climate tech or policy who really influenced how you think about this problem.
Yeah, I'm going to say Louis Alvarez. Again, I was a kid at the time, so but I think his perspective on nuclear power and how great it is was a fantastic influence.
What's the biggest myth about nuclear you wish would die?
That we don't need a waste solution because the volume of waste is so small.
Who else in this world of decentralized energy, reindustrialization should I talk to? Going direct.
Good question. I'd go talk to some drilling companies. I think the amount of innovation that we're seeing in the drilling industry and even natural gas is tremendous.
Are you seeing some startups coming out in the drilling space, or is it incumbents that are doing pretty interesting stuff?
I think both. I think, and by drilling, I guess I should have been clearer. I'm also talking about geothermal. So drilling for heat, which is something that we're leveraging ourselves, but it's some very exciting new companies in that space.
Cool. How can people reach you and follow Deep Fission?
So we've got a website, deepfission.com, and there's lots of information there, including a contact us space.
Great. And we'll put that out. We'll put that out in the show notes. Well, Liz, thank you so much for your time and giving us a little Energy 101 at the beginning. I think the folks will appreciate it because you broke everything down in a way that's very easy to understand. So I appreciate it.
Yeah. No pun intended, I hope, in breaking everything down.
Well, merci beaucoup. Et à bientôt.
Merci, Jordan. Thank you so much.